Great. And now it's recording. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, depending where you are. Welcome to SIG API Machinery bi-weekly meeting for Kubernetes open source. My name is Federico Bongiovanni. I'm here with my co-leads and co-chairs. Today is August 9, 2023. We are going to go through a couple of topics today, and the first one is from Mo. So I will let you start with it, Mo.
Yeah, so it's just mostly meant as a question/discussion slot. Obviously, I know today you can host an aggregated API server on the cluster with a Kubernetes service, and then wire it all up to an API service, and it all works. I was reading through like the service resolving code and all that logic there, and I couldn't exactly tell how far you could stretch that. The gist of my thought process for a use case was just I want to be able to have an aggregated API service, but not host any of it on the cluster. So basically just point it to a remote endpoint somewhere. Obviously, then it brings up all the concerns about API server accessing network stuff based on a config that's in the API, which might not be under the control of the right actor. But yeah, I think David, you and I talked about this a long time ago, but I don't actually remember.
It has been a very long time. The very first implementation of aggregation actually did allow arbitrary URLs. At the time, Daniel expressed concerns. I wish he was here. It happens many times, but I wish he was here so we could ask him this time. Not going to bother him in his rest. I can imagine some concerns around addressability, similar to the questions we had with UVIP. This one, however, it definitely goes through the external service code that goes to the connectivity server.
Mm-hmm.
I am wondering if you can't just set whatever endpoint IPs you want already. I thought you could. Does that not already work?
Oh, so like create a service, manually set its IPs to whatever you want, and then just abuse that basically.
I'm not asking about abuse per se. I am wondering if that is already a path to do what you want.
Maybe. I didn't try it too specifically. Like I was looking at the code, and like the way we do service resolution is dramatically different based on if you have the aggregating routing flag set or not, which is a little awkward if you want to. I mean, I guess I don't care if this works on someone else's cluster as much as about mine.
I think a good starting point is going to be figuring out what is actually available today, rather than necessarily what people intended, right? What can actually be done. And I think as a starting point for discussion, that's going to be important for people to know. I don't have a fundamental concern with it myself. There are, and why not? So it is different than an admission webhook, Ben. The difference is that you can get, and it is a proxy result, not a separate call. And the Kube API server says act as this user. So if you own a cluster and you can point it at another cluster, you are able to do things like I am a system master here, go run this call somewhere else in a certain identity of system master. When you use admission webhooks, you can't do that. So yeah, it's going to be worthwhile understanding what we have in existence already. And I don't think I'm fundamentally opposed to allowing someone to set a URL. But I might be. I have to think about it.
So I don't remember the history too much. So you're saying originally you let basically any URL in there, and then you.
So it was an initial prototype. My first prototype was based on a string URL, not based on a service. And truth be told, like I said, I don't actually know whether you can wire this up and manage the service or endpoints manually. I think you could definitely race. But you have limitations then on, say, the server name that's going to be expected. And so you could still fail negotiation if the thing you're pointing at isn't actually my service. You would still fail negotiation. If you gave it a URL, you would no longer fail. So you can imagine me trying to point my aggregated API server URL, if I had a URL, to Jordan's cluster. And then I am a system master in my cluster, and I'm pointed at Jordan's cluster. And if someone does not have distinct trust domains for the different clusters, which I agree would probably be a configuration error, but if they did not, then suddenly I'm able to act as a particular API service, a particular group against Jordan's cluster. And if I do something devious, like create an API service for a CRD that is important in Jordan's cluster, I could potentially do clever things, nefarious things with my powers.
Okay. I mean, that makes sense. Yeah. So I can try to poke at, see what I can like come up with. And
I think I've talked myself into arbitrary URLs are a bad idea. I don't know if I've convinced anyone else based on that story that arbitrary URLs are a good idea.
I guess if arbitrary URLs are so I think if you don't have the enable-aggregator-routing flag, we let you use a service that has an external name set. I just don't know what it does because I didn't try it.
Yeah, I would expect us to require the server name to match that service, right? So if in the example I gave, Jordan's cluster, sorry, I'm just looking at your picture. Jordan's cluster does not respond with a certificate valid for service whatever. I would expect the TLS negotiation to fail. So I would never submit the request. And that would be
but hold on, David. In this case, you're saying you're being malicious. So you would just set insecure skip TLS verify equals true to let the TLS negotiation just go through because you're actually trying to attack the other server. You don't actually care if you have a secure connection.
I thought that I intentionally made that impossible.
No, you made it very possible. It really annoys me that flag is present.
Okay, that surprises me. And yeah, I am disappointed in past David for allowing that.
Yeah. So yeah, you can totally set insecure skip TLS verify true. It's like one of the only places you can on the API.
Okay. So, past David made a serious mistake.
Yeah, so I don't think you can rely on server name resolution to protect you from a malicious actor that has a very high privilege on a particular cluster and trying to use it to then attack a different cluster. I just don't think you can do that because the actor would just keep tweaking the config.
Yeah, let's see what's currently possible today.
Okay. Yeah, I can poke at that. That'll be kind of a fun experiment. But yeah, I guess just stepping back for a second, regardless of what's possible today, is it a good idea to support externally hosted aggregated API servers? That's sort of like the thought process I'm thinking about, right? Like, should all aggregated API servers be co-located on the server, like on the same Kubernetes cluster, or would it be okay to have like a SaaS? Not that I want to build
so a side effect would be that in order to share an aggregated API server, it would have to trust every cluster trying to use it to act as a front proxy for establishing identity for.
So by the way, I don't intend on doing that. I mostly just want to be able to host an aggregate API server in a way that's not on the cluster. I won't share them across clusters because I know better. But you see what I mean, right? I today host my Kubernetes API servers in a way that the Kubernetes cluster admin can't influence basically any of their config.
I understand.
I can't do that for like the metrics server because it's literally sitting on the cluster.
I understand.
Yeah, I'm less clear if that's a good way of thinking about this, if this is a good use case, or if aggregation wasn't meant for that style of deployment.
I can see the appeal. I can also see the risk.
I think even more than the aggregated server trusting kubeAPI server as a front proxy, we would expect aggregated servers to delegate authorization calls back to the central server. And so you would also need network visibility from this off-cluster aggregated server back to kubeAPI server to make those authorization calls.
Yeah, but like let's pretend for a second I'm like running these things as static pods that are co-located beside each other.
Yeah.
That's not really an issue for me, right? It's more of just like the alternative is I run the aggregated API server as like a deployment or something in the cluster, and now like it's in the cluster.
I think knowing what currently exists is still an important starting point.
Yeah.
I think enumerating out the problems that could ensue with a malicious actor is worthwhile.
The two top level options, aggregator routing enabled or not, and then targeting like what types of services are currently work.
Yeah, I can do that. Sounds like a little fun exercise, but yeah. I think that covers it for me, unless anybody else had any thoughts.
So I think Dr. Szymanski talked about something similar to this at KubeCon 2022. I put a couple links in the chat.
You're talking about KubeBind, I think?
Yes.
So I will admit I stared at the KubeBind repo trying to figure out how it worked, but there was so many very fancy looking diagrams. As far as I could tell, though, it was purely based off of CRDs and syncing CRDs across different levels of clusters. The kind of service I'm talking about can't be implemented as a CRD. It would be more dynamic than what you can do with just pure CRUD.
Got it.
Yeah. Otherwise, I've been like, yeah, look, Stefan already did all the work for me. I'll just go use that.
Okay, so sounds like Mo, whenever you have the time to try this out, you will let us know how that goes and your findings.
Yep. Whenever I get that done, I'll add it back to some future agenda.
Okay, I appreciate that. Thank you so much. Okay, next item. Geeta, are you there?
Hi, yes, I'm here. This is the first time I'm attending this meeting, so hello to everyone.
Welcome.
I have been part of the HCD community for some time, so I bring a HCD related question here today. The proposal is that can we have a separate HCD cluster for CRDs, just like we allow for events? And the motivation to propose this is similar to the motivation for moving events out to another cluster, which is mainly to protect the performance of the main HCD cluster. I got comments from Dr. Szymanski suggesting that this is something that was discussed earlier, but it's not clear if this is architecturally aligned. So I'm willing to investigate this further if this is architecturally aligned with future direction.
I vaguely recall that we had a discussion about the way that you would configure something like this. So there's a Kube API server command line flag that you can use to separate out which etcd is used for storage between some resources, but it's not enabled for CRDs. And I think one of the questions was, would we want to continue to extend that flag and make it even more complicated? Or do you want to switch to something like component config as a way of enabling these types of things? Do you remember, David, having that conversation?
I don't remember it with component config. I do remember there were questions about using a flag where you had to predict the name of the CRDs that you were interested in. It's not as simple as I want all custom resources to be stored separately, because even if your goal is I want a separate etcd for all my important things for servicing the control plane, there are important CRDs for your control plane that will be CRDs, right? And you have to know which ones those are.
Yeah. I remember now. Daniel had been pointing out that since CRDs are dynamic, using a flag that is statically configured at the startup of an API server seems not to match very well with the life cycle of CRDs. Like, you introduce a CRD, now you have to restart the API server to say where it's stored. That's kind of like a chicken and egg problem. Do you restart the API server first and set up the flag and then configure the CRD? It seemed messy.
So is it something that I should dig into, or is there another architectural proposal that will give similar outcome, which is to basically separate the two?
You say two. Which two do you mean?
So we have seen, so I work for EKS and we are managed Kubernetes service, and we often see things like Argo events or DEX objects, which are millions and get listed a lot, and they affect the performance of the cluster, etcd cluster. So if there was a mechanism to separate out those, and those is not like all CRDs, they should be configurable. If there was a mechanism to do so, it would give us a way to give better performance.
Okay, so it's not, so you're talking about two different categories, but it's not clear to me how you would establish which category is which. Yeah, so I see Jordan has a hand, sorry. You can't change it after the fact.
Mo was before Jordan, if I...
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, so a few things. Let's see. Very recently, I refactored all the horrible code that implements this layer of routing for storage, and so it's a lot cleaner now. So technically implementable is much easier now. The thing I was going to ask though is to Joe, your point, right? Encryption at rest lets you configure what custom resources that you want encrypted. Whether they exist or not, or come or go, isn't really relevant to it. So I understand the ugliness of it, but it does technically sort of work. This one's a little more painful in the sense that, like, if you did it after the fact, you would just lose the existing data, because you would just tell the API server to look at the wrong place, so like it wouldn't have any idea where to find it. Maybe that's fine. I guess though I was gonna ask, like, would it be so bad to just let you configure just all CRDs in a different place? Because at least it would.
Well, it probably wouldn't support the goal, right? So imagine you have an etcd, you wanted to put Argo on it because Argo crushed your etcd server, but you have a CRD that represents your CSI driver, so, or your CNI plugin of some kind. You're not money ahead by putting them together, because if you are unable to establish how your storage or network should work, you're in the same spot you were before.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair. I was curious where like the boundary of like fault domain was getting established, right? Like I could see 3 boundaries that because those exist in the API server today, which is core resources, aggregated resources, and CRDs, right? So you could split it out that way if that was where the fault domains that you had lied.
So ideally, we would like it to be configurable, but if there is dramatic difference between the effort required for separating out all CRDs versus a specific one, all CRDs might be something to think about for me as the requester for this. But in general, is this a good idea? Should I start digging into it further?
It's a non-trivial idea, right? I agree that there are issues around prediction of what you would want to place in one location versus another. There are problems with who is actually making that decision, right? In the example I think you have, I believe you would like Amazon to be able to make the decision about which resources go in which location, but a user creates the CRD. I think there are potential issues around crosstalk. What if I put mine in a spot that you don't like it? And there are issues around reassigning after the fact. What if you don't know in time you want to move something?
Right.
I won't say that I'm uninterested in a solution. I just wouldn't underestimate how much there is to consider, and a design is going to have to consider those things.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Even I'm not clear who makes the decision. Like I would leave it up to the customer. We can just recommend that this is what's happening to your cluster, split it out, and they could make the config change. Or as an operator, we could do it. So who makes the change is unclear to me also. Just looking for a mechanism to make the change and establish authorization over who can do it, and then go from there, perhaps. So I agree, this does seem non-trivial to me, of course, but something I'm interested in digging into if it's not already in progress somewhere else, otherwise I would join that effort.
I just posted in chat it was actually back in the history of the agenda notes, one of the issues that had been open about this before, or actually a PR had been open about it before and then closed. I'm kind of with David. I would be really interested to see somebody dig in and try and tease apart all the problems that exist here. How is the flag defined and configured? Is this for all CRDs? Can you do it per CRD? I would be very concerned if we did it for all CRDs that somebody's later going to come to us and be like, I need it just for one CRD, and then we can't support that, and then we have to add that on. Is it worse to add that on later than it is to just support individual CRDs from the get-go? Or can you like have a pattern where you match all CRDs in a group and put them in something? So I kind of would want to see something that at least considers not just one use case, but many of the possible use cases people could come to us with.
All right, sounds good. I will review this issue, the 82580 issue. I see the component config term. I'm not familiar with it, but was that the last design thought that was being pursued?
That was talking about how we give configuration to the API server, like whether we do it in flags or whether we do it in a more structured way, and trying to add complexity around the etcd overrides flag. Like it was already kind of a twisty command line flag, and this was trying to add like more things you could express in there. Okay. We kind of didn't want to explode the complexity of that flag. That's pretty orthogonal to whether or not to allow changing etcd locations for custom resources. One question I have, you mentioned like ideally the customer would get to choose where these things go. That seems really strange to me actually for a managed offering. Presumably you don't expose etcd level options to the customer today. They just run Kubernetes, and you decide, whether to put events in one etcd or not. It seems pretty strange to give them visibility and control to storage level configuration. So I wouldn't think we would put etcd level or storage level options up into the API. So like on a CRD, you could say, store this in this etcd or that etcd. So then you get like this weird mismatch where the person configuring the API server, whether it's by flags or by component config, like however it's configured, the person doing that is different than the person creating the CRD. And
yeah, you're right. I should clarify. What I meant is that I'm not sure who will make the decision. If it turns out that it's unacceptable for the operator to make these calls for some reason, then we could explore getting approval from customer or authorization of some sort. But as of now, it's TBD. And you are right. Today, HCD is internal concern. Like they don't know or have any control over HCD configuration.
It's worth noting that the only use of this etcd override that I'm aware of is to relocate where Kubernetes events get persisted, and those expire after like an hour or a day. So I actually don't know of anyone using this option to relocate data that persists that we care about. So I think that should probably give pause. Like a lot of the complicated issues, like what happens if you change it after the fact, or what if you can't move from one to another, like those just sort of hand wave and go away with events, because it's like, they were going to go away after an hour or after 24 hours anyway. So we kind of just don't worry about those. That's why people use it to relocate events. So doing it generally for data that you may care a lot about is just a lot scarier.
Okay. The motivation is improving performance. And yeah, if we do it, the second cluster would also be a first-class citizen. Like it would also have all the maintenance and data protection workflows that we do today for the main cluster. But that's how I think about it. But let me reflect on this feedback as I start digging into it. So
yeah, there might also be, if your goal is better CRD performance, things like CRD binary protocols were discussed, I think, in our last meeting as a way of improving performance. So it might be more fruitful to look into some things that are just directly tied to making everything more performant. I mean, I've seen a lot of etcd clusters where you're IOPS bound, and it doesn't matter how many etcds you run on the machines. If you're running them on the same machine, you're going to be IOPS bound. You're not going to get extra performance for splitting across them.
our observation is the object count. Sometimes it gets into millions and affects the performance.
That one's also interesting. I have seen cases where no matter what you do, the use case will keep creating more objects until you find a scalability limit. Right. So if you give them 10, if you had 10 million as the limit before and you change things to make it better, they'll hit the 10 million limit or whatever the next limit is. So in some cases, it might be better to find a way to restrict what the total reasonable number of objects of something can be.
Right. I was going to say two things. Believe it or not, I cannot find how to raise a hand. Maybe because I'm the host of the meeting. So I don't know, for the posterity. So one is, this is, I know it's not the question you asked, but from when you said Argo, it came to my mind a lot of cases that I have seen in production where Argo was the problem. And sometimes we found that actually there was not like a human person creating these objects. Of course, especially because it's a CI/CD tool, mostly Argo, the family. Like it's an automated process, misconfigure, going crazy, and the solution was not to give more storage or more performance, was to solve the root cause. So maybe that helps you. Sorry. And the second is a question for the group, because Joe was talking about limiting the number of objects, and I know we have resource quota for the native types, but we don't have it, as far as I know, for CRDs, right?
We do. We can restrict by object count in
Okay.
any namespace, not cluster scoped resources.
Okay, so that could be another way of guardrailing, your clusters, Gita, like looking into that. But if there is a, valid, genuine case why Argo has to create millions of objects and you restrict it, you may run into side effects also there, right?
Right. Most of these cases, we kind of don't know if the workload was, we have limited context on
Right.
the workload. So pushing back is a tricky decision because we don't have the information insight about is it doing real work or not. Sounds good. Thanks a lot for all the feedback. I will review the old issue mainly and dig a little bit more, and probably will stop by again for one more round of discussion.
Very good.
Thank you.
Well, I guess that's all for today. Thank you, everybody, for joining. We'll upload the recording later. I posted the playlist where all the meeting goes, and I will see, hopefully, many of you again in 2 weeks. Have a great Wednesday and rest of your week. Thank you for joining.
Thank you.